All right. Thank you for having me. Glad to be here. So I didn't really plan anything. So all I brought was a history of the popes. So I'm just going to start from page 1 and try to get comfortable because we got a good way to go. I'm just kidding. Jim said to be sure to talk about your heritage. And when I mentioned that I would be at this conference, somebody on Twitter said, "Are you really from the South? Where are you actually from? What's your actual heritage?" I said, "I am from the South. I'm from South Khazaria, and I'm a KGB Jew, and I'm here to wreck and infiltrate and destroy and subvert." I'm just kidding. That's a joke. I know a lot of people can't take jokes, but no, I am full-blooded Southern. My dad's side is English. The Dyers tended the royal swans, which I don't know if that's something to be proud of or if that was something that's kind of ignominious. That's true. And then my mom's side is clan. We're Scottish, so we're Clan Scott and Clan. I forget the other one, but when I looked into this, it turns out that we have a castle. It's all in ruins, but the Queen owns the castle, so I'm not happy about that. Caerlaverloch is the name of the castle, and I want to get that back from the Queen. So we got to figure out how to do that later. Anyway, so let's talk about something that you probably won't expect me to talk about this. I want to talk about how philosophy is worthless. And, I prayed about this, and this is kind of what came to me to talk about. And it ended up synergizing very well with the talks that we've heard so far, because I think a lot of people hear ortho bros and they hear people arguing and talking about philosophy. And a lot of people assume, you just like to talk about philosophy. You like to argue and you just want to talk about all this high abstract stuff. But what I think both my good friend, Father Deacon Dr. Ananias, and I have discovered as we have spent a lot of time in philosophy is actually that philosophy is quite worthless. I don't mean real philosophy in the sense of Christ as the wisdom of God or something like that, but I mean the secular abstract discipline of philosophy. If we think about the logos in John 1, this is not the logos of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. It's not the logos of Hellenism. There might be some overlap. There might be some parallels, but the logos in John 1 is pulling from the Hebrew wisdom tradition. It's not an impersonal abstract force. It's the I am. In fact, the logos of John 1, we know in the triads of St. Gregory Palamas, he talks about in Exodus 3, when God said I am in 14 and 15, he did not say I am it, but I am he. That is the personal, relational, covenantal God that Israel has a relationship with. This is the one who can show his face to Moses. But as Jesus says in John 1:18, or as John says in John 1:18, and Jesus says in John 6:46, no man sees God, no man sees the Father at any time. Yet someone saw this God. In Exodus 3, the same face, the same presence, the same angel is said chapters later in 23 to remit sins. He has the name of Yahweh in him. We don't find that in created beings, even throughout the Old Testament. In dozens of other passages, we also find that Yahweh and his angel presence, face, glory, messenger also have his spirit accompanying this presence, this manifestation. So the God of Revelation, this is a personal God. This is a triad revealed throughout the scriptures, throughout divine revelation, as the Father who is the source, the fount, the arche, that eternally begets his Son, and the Spirit who proceeds through that Son and manifests and shines forth through that Son. In Orthodox theology and tridology, this one cause or arche is the Father, the sole cause that keeps this deity personal. Why am I talking about this? Well, one thing that we have engaged in is a lot of interactions with other religions, other non-religious people over the last several years, last 7 or 8 years. And one thing that comes to the fore is there's commonalities that I've noticed between the other religions and what they offer, what they present, the deity that they discuss. There might be some idea that there's a personal relationship with the Jewish God with the Muslim God or something like that, but it is certainly nothing like what we offer. And so in the domain of philosophy, this is usually referred to as classical theism. Dr. Ed Feser, the famous Thomist, for example, writes about the classical theist God is the God of Aristotle, Plato, Plotinus, Maimonides, Muhammad, and Aquinas. Really? So it seems a little off there. Something's a little off because, again, to quote St. Gregory Palamas, when God appears in Exodus 3, it's not a supreme essence. It's not a supreme thing. I remember, didn't Biden say something like, oh, yeah, but we believe in the thing? Talking about God, the thing? I was like, is Biden a classical theist? What's he talking about? No, we believe in a deity that is uniquely contrasted to the type of deity that we see amongst the world religions and classical theism. In Orthodox triadology, this one calls this Father Arche that has a Son and a Spirit. This talk is not mainly about theology, believe it or not. It's actually going to be a little more down to earth. But this part is theological. When the Son takes on the hypostatic property of the Father, what happens is we have a move towards what many theologians have called essentialism, or the primacy of the divine essence, or the ousia, or the one, over against the starting point of theology and our relationship with God, and the ordo theology and our actual relationship. These aren't abstract, these are connected. We have a movement away from God as personal to God as metaphysical being to study, a thing to program like an algorithm, a science project, something to look at in a test tube and try to figure out. But that's not what we read about in Scripture, for example. To tie this into the South, the Bible Belt, the Bible. I grew up Protestant, and so I'm thankful for being given a lot of biblical indoctrination and a biblical heritage, you could say, from the South. And I'm glad that we heard Flannery O'Connor cited many times. She's one of my favorites. She talked about the South as Christ haunted, the ghost of Christ that haunts the South, because it's not exactly fully Christian, but there's the ghost of Christ there, which I think is a profound idea. And that's why Orthodoxy really makes the most sense for a Southerner, believe it or not, because everything that the Southerner kind of prioritizes kind of lines up with what Orthodoxy prioritizes: the virtues, the honor, the tradition, etc. But if we contrast this to the Latin theology of the Middle Ages, particularly Roman Catholic, Thomistic, and even Anselmian theology, we get, as I said, the move away from beginning point of the person of the Father in our theology and our relationship with God, and a move towards a philosophical essentialism, the monad as primary, thus subordinating the personal, the existential, to the metaphysical and the abstract. Thus, the philosophical God of the Hellenists, of Plato, of Aristotle, of the pre-Socratics, etc., is a God of abstract principles. He's more like a number or a force. The personal God that is orthodox in Orthodox Christianity is relational. He is not abstracted. He is not far off. In fact, Paul says this when he's preaching. The word is near you, even in your heart. So God, we could say, has being as one of his divine energies, but God is not identical to pure being, as the philosophers say. The God of the philosophers, if we were to contrast this deity to our deity, and I'm speaking kind of generally here as a survey of a lot of the Greek philosophers, cannot be in time and space. In fact, Dr. Ed Feser himself, in his book, 5 Proofs, in the chapter on the Neoplatonic proof of the classical theist God, quote, cannot be in time and space. Well, that might be a little problematic if you believe in the incarnation. This God is absolutely simple, undifferentiated unity, a pure monad, a purely active, eternal actualizer in Aristotle, impersonal thought thinking itself, eternally moving a world or the heavens opposite of him. This deity is cast out in opposition to the many, to flux, and to temporality. So what's ontologically better is the one, is stasis, and is eternality. And he's opposite all the things that are not that. This God or this deity is eternally willing itself at all times for all eternity and is thus unchanging and supposedly pure actuality. In fact, Aquinas goes so far as to say that the divine persons are only notionally or conceptually distinct from the divine essence. And so in that sense, it would seem like the divine persons are also reducible to pure actuality. Well, this is not the deity that becomes incarnate. The God of Aristotle, of Plotinus, etc., if he is all of these categories and characteristics that we've listed, these attributes, that's not a God who responds to prayer. Now, I'm not saying that God changes, but rather that God condescends to interact with and synergize with his creatures. It's not that we act upon him to change his essence or force him to do anything. He wills to have that reciprocal relationship. But that is impossible for the God of the philosophers. So the God that we serve is not found in Roman Catholicism, Islam, Judaism, Unitarianism, etc., because all of those religions and faiths explicitly want and desire a classical theist God. Now, many Roman Catholics are better than their theology. I'm not saying that they don't love God or that they don't have degrees of grace and so forth, but the confession of the system itself, the public theology that's dogmatized, is really the root issue here, that it attempted to make the faith accessible to the world. And thus, classical theism is just simply a foreign deity. The thing that I've noticed in the last 7 or 8 years of interacting with all kinds of people across the board, particularly all of the top Muslims, and I'm not saying that to brag, I didn't ever expect that. That happened totally providentially. I had no interest in Islam whatsoever. And we had some friends in the UK who became Orthodox, and one of them was for a while, a catechist under Bishop Irenae. And he said, Jay, we've got to respond to Islam. And I said, why? I live in the Bible Belt. I don't see Muslims, although now I do, because this was 2017. And now when I go to Nashville, or if I drive around Jacksonville, I see mosques suddenly everywhere. We drove to Las Vegas last year, and I saw a mosque on an Indian reservation. I started to read about the Saudis and others and how this is actually going down. And they've been putting billions of dollars for many, many years into Islamic education, the building of mosques and so forth. Point I'm saying is, we will be encountering the Muslim discussion, I guarantee you, in the next several years, because what we see in places like the UK, they're really just 10, 15, 20 years ahead of what's intended for us. Now, maybe providentially won't get that way. I feel like it will, though. I feel like we will continue to encounter things like Islam, maybe not so much Judaism, although I've had minimal debates with Jews and so forth in the last few years. The point of all this is that there's a common thread I've noticed between the interactions with the Jews and the Muslims and the Roman Catholics and the other world religions, the Unitarian world faiths, is that the more that we go to the scriptures, we see how preposterous those religions are. Even though they lay claim to some degree of attachment to the Torah or something like that, we know that, of course, Judaism is actually Talmudic. We know that Islam is actually based on copy-paste weird things out of the scriptures, out of Gnostic texts, and that Islam itself actually borrows from the Talmud. Many people don't know this, but there's quite a bit of Talmudic influence on Islam as well. So what this gives us is this unknowable, unreachable Unitarian deity that's pretty much the same deity as the philosophers, the classical theist God, the God of pure act who cannot be in time and space, cannot manifest. And when you debate with the more scholarly people from these religions, well, Christianity and Christ and the Trinity, it's all illogical, it's irrational, it doesn't make any sense. And so Allah or Hashem or God or the thing, the one, has to be this perfect thing, and perfection is a presupposition based on what they believe metaphysics dictates. But as we've seen tonight or today in the previous talks, again, providentially, it fits perfectly with what I want to discuss. This deity is not that deity. We do not put metaphysics, the arbitrary dogmas of Aristotle and Plato and Aquinas or whoever else before divine revelation. Doesn't mean that philosophy can't be a helpful tool. Certainly the Cappadocians made heavy use of various Neoplatonic philosophical ideas, terminology, and so forth. St. Maximus utilized both Neoplatonic and Aristotelian ideas and categories, but it's never, at least the intention isn't. Maybe sometimes even some of the saints and fathers were too philosophical, but the intention was never to have philosophy dictate and confine divine revelation. And so though I wouldn't go so far as to say that in a strict sense, God contradicts himself. Many Orthodox theologians have talked about God transcending logical categories and transcending the antinomies, or what we think from the human vantage point are oppositions or contradictions. The Trinity is a mystery. It transcends created logical categories, but it's not crazy or incoherent. In fact, it is itself found all throughout divine revelation. The strongest case I've seen against Islam and Judaism has been, in fact, that the Old Testament teaches the Trinity everywhere. And if you really pay attention with divine illumination, these theophanies are quite often, almost usually, Christophanies. So the Christophanies themselves long ago have refuted the Unitarian deity of the philosophers and the Jews and the Muslims. And that's because our deity is much like the deity that appears to Jacob. In Genesis 28, we read, Jacob went out from the well of Oath towards Haran. He came to a certain place and stayed there all night because the sun had set. He took one of the stones of that place and put it at his head, and he lay on that place to sleep. When he dreamed, behold, he saw a ladder, and it was set up on the earth. Its top reached to heaven, and there the angels of God were ascending and descending upon it. Behold, the Lord stood above it. So the Lord is standing. And we find this many, many times in the theophanies that God comes down and he stands there, which is a bodily reference, even though Christ isn't incarnate yet. The Lord stood and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. Do not fear. I will give you this land, and you will be a great nation, etc. So again, reiterating the promise to Abraham. And then in Genesis 31, we have another theophany, another appearance of Christ to Jacob. The angel of the Lord spoke to me in a dream. Jacob, here I am. Lift up your eyes. See the male goats and the rams, etc. I am the God who appeared to you at Bethel. So an appearance, a manifestation of theophany, where you anointed the pillar and made a vow. I will be with you. And then we read, then Jacob asked, this is Genesis 32, tell me your name. He said, why do you ask my name? Very similar to what is said to Samson's parents. Why do you ask my name, seeing as it is wonderful? So we know it's the same speaker that spoke to Manoah. Why do you ask my name? It is wonderful. He blessed him there. Jacob called that place the form of God, for I saw God's face. I saw God face to face, much like Moses is said to see God face to face. And thus my soul was saved. When the form of God passed by, the sun rose on him, but he limped on his hip. This is, of course, after the wrestling with the Lord. This makes no sense according to classical theism. This deity doesn't appear. He certainly doesn't wrestle with Jacob. He's not called the form and the face of God in time and space. That's just not philosophically possible. And yet, once again, what do we read in Leviticus? Leviticus 9, we have a very similar situation. But I really like this passage because it's very problematic for any position that, again, wants to restrict what God can and can't do based on arbitrary categories of human created human logic. I'm not saying God didn't create logic, but just calling it created categories. Aaron lifted up his hand towards the people, this is Leviticus 9, and he blessed them and came down from the sin offering and the burnt offerings and the peace offerings. After this, Moses and Aaron went into the tabernacle, and they came out and blessed all the people, and the glory of God appeared to all the people. How do all the people see the glory of God? Well, we know about the glory cloud in the Old Testament. And we know again in Numbers 12, we're told that the Lord came down in the cloud, descended in the pillar, and stood at the door of the tabernacle. So again, bodily movement standing there at the tabernacle. For example, when he appears to Gideon in Judges, I think it's Judges 6, it says, Yahweh turned his face to Gideon. The God of the philosophers doesn't have a face. He doesn't have a form. He doesn't manifest in time and space. He's not a theophanic deity. Thus, this is so key and so simple, actually, for those that are biblically literate, in terms of combating and refuting other world religions that also lay claim to these same passages and texts, at least to some degree with Islam, Judaism. But again, mainly I think Islam is the thing that we will be combating in the future, because the system, the establishment, the global elite, they really see that this is a way to alter and change the West more so than perhaps any of the other cults or sects or groups, New Agers or whatever. This one seems to have the real meat when it comes to altering people groups and changing demographic warfare, let's just call it that. Well, again, Philippians 2, we read that Christ, who was in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but humbled himself and took on our form. This is the famous kenosis passage, where we know that God the Son, willingly limited himself in time and space. He didn't lose any of his powers, but in a sense, he didn't exercise every power, every dunamis that he had when he became incarnate. When he was walking around in Jerusalem, he was not doing the conflagration. He was not creating the world. This, again, is why there's a difference between what God is, his essence, and what God does, his actions or his energies. But if Christ is the deity that becomes incarnate and steps into time and space and becomes our advocate, our redeemer, our savior, our perfect man, then it's not the God of classical theism. And all of the strivings of classical theism and the God of the philosophers really didn't amount to much. Thus, I think philosophy is kind of worthless. And I'm speaking here of worldly philosophy. Certainly we have St. Justin Martyr, the philosopher. But even perhaps Justin at times might have been a little too philosophical. And certainly many of the disciples, Tatian and others, who were known as the Logos apologists, made this mistake of putting philosophy and metaphysics before what we're actually taught in divine revelation. We read in St. Justin Popovich, in Orthodox Faith and Life in Christ, an excellent section where he talks about perfection. And you notice the idea of perfection in the classical theist tradition or the world religions is this metaphysical thing. It's the one that's got to be no distinctions, and it's out there. It's not in time and space, and it's totally abstract, and it's this and that. It's eternal. It's opposite time and space and flux. But what if perfection isn't mainly just some metaphysical speculation? What if it's actually about a person? And I thought this was a really good insight that, and again, this matters because when you say debate a Muslim says, well, God, Allah, is perfect because he's not in time and space. He can't incarnate. That's why he's perfect. Well, how do we know that that's what is perfect? It's just an assumption. And St. Joseph Popovich says, was Plato perhaps the perfect man? Well, why did Plato want to leave this world and get back to the ideas, the eternal ideas, if he was the perfect man? What about Buddha? Well, Buddha wanted to escape and achieve nirvana, so he wasn't perfect. What about Moses? Well, Moses continued to seek help from heaven. Moses made his own mistakes. What about Muhammad? Well, Muhammad was a bloodthirsty warlord, and he offered a sensual paradise after destroying the infidels. So it doesn't seem very perfect. What about Kant and the philosophy of German idealism? No, the meta-rationalistic Ding an sich, the world of the beyond that we can never know, really puts us in a skeptical state. What about great literary figures like Shakespeare? St. Justin Popovich says, well, Shakespeare pointed us to the worlds above, but that doesn't really seem like a perfect man. And then he lists other characters, Nietzsche and others. And what's missing in all these is that none of them are the God-man. What if the God-man is just simply the perfect man, and that perfection isn't an abstract category that we judge God or metaphysics by, but the divine revelation of the Son of God is perfect God, perfect man, and thus the God-man himself is the perfect example of philosophy come to life as living wisdom. Philosophy is an abstract, really ultimately, I am the way, I'm the truth, I'm the life, is a personal living philosophical being, but not abstract philosophy. It's a lived, practical, experiential philosophy. He says, the one who has the fullness of mystery, the wondrous God-man, in a divine way perfect and humanly real. His human goodness is divinely perfect and complete. His human love is divinely perfect and complete. So is his righteousness, his mercy, and his compassion. His eternality and his beauty. All are humanly real, but also divinely perfect and complete. Nothing is miraculous because he has transformed all things human to divine. He has completed and perfected everything by the divine. In one word, the whole man in him is divinely perfected and divinely completed, so he is the God-man. And I think that's really the key differentiation here, is that at the end of the day, all this philosophical stuff, all of these world religions and the classical theist God, it's just missing the incarnation, and that's pretty much everything. I don't know if I'm over time or if this is the limit or where we're at. Is there any more? 5 minutes? I'll take questions if anybody has any questions. 4 or 5 minutes only. So raise your hand if you have any questions. That's okay. Right. Oh, absolutely. If you're talking to your average everyday dude, you don't have to go into the philosophical stuff, because most of the time people are going to be thinking in the way that St. Justin Popovich is laying it out, moral perfection. If you're talking to a philosophy guy or some trained Thomist, they're thinking in terms of metaphysical categories. But I agree with you that if you're talking to the philosophy guy, that's when I would say, how do we know that that's what perfection is? For example, they'll say something like, well, absolute unity is real, true perfection. Well, I thought God was a triad. And the Cappadocians say that he's equally triad as much as he is monad. He's not more one than he is three, or more three than he is one. So there's an equal ultimacy in the Trinity. And so Thomas, or a Roman Catholic as an example, or a Muslim, they're going to start their assumption about what perfection is with their system. Well, we know what perfection is because Allah is perfect, and to be perfect is to be purely one and to not be many. But then you say, well, but wait a minute, Allah has 99 attributes, and most Sunnis think they're really distinct. So now you're in a bind. So that's what I would do. I'd just say, how do we know what perfection is? On what standard? Great question.
Other question? And Jay, repeat the question for the recording.
Yeah, his question was, how do we know what to say in terms of apologetic discussions when the idea of what's perfection comes up, which actually does come up quite a bit if you're talking to a Muslim or something like that. And I was distinguishing that from, well, if you're talking to like a regular guy, they're probably thinking moral perfection, and you don't have to worry too much about critiquing the word and the presuppositions. But if you're speaking to a philosophical guy, you might want to say, how do we know what perfection is, and says who? Where did you get that arbitrary standard?
This question back there, Jay.
The question was, other religions talk of love. Buddha talks about love. Other people talk about love. What is the difference? For us, love is twofold. There's human created love that every man, every woman has to some degree for their relations, for others. And there's uncreated love. None of these other world religions are going to have any conception of uncreated love and the participation in the uncreated energy of divine love. That's the big difference. So you have to stress creator-creature distinction, and that none of the world religions, because they don't have the essence-centered, literally Orthodox Christianity is the only religion that has the essence-centered distinction. Thus, to talk about love or other virtues, there's created versions of those that humans have. You could say naturally, but that's not all we need. We also need divine love and to meld with and to blend with, as the Cappadocians say, not that we lose our created properties, but to really participate in uncreated love. That's the difference. And the world religions don't have that. I mean, they might have some kind of melding into the divine, but you lose your identity and your existence if you meld into that in other world religions. So that's where the energies come in. Last one. None of them. St. Gregory Palamas says that existence is a divine energy. So anything that you predicate of God, even God's unity, even God's existence, are themselves also energies. So it's none of those categories or systems, because Orthodox Christian theology is completely unique.